A quiet shift tends to happen in many people's lives somewhere in their late 20s or 30s. Income rises, stability improves, and the sense of finally becoming comfortable begins to settle in. Rent moves to a nicer neighborhood, the car payment becomes slightly larger, groceries become less price-sensitive, and small conveniences start to feel justified because life finally seems to be moving forward. On the surface, this progression appears to represent success. Yet beneath this improvement sits a structural pattern that economists and behavioral researchers have observed repeatedly across developed economies. The cost of maintaining what society labels as a middle-class life tends to expand at a pace that quietly absorbs the very income increases that were supposed to create breathing room. The phenomenon is not driven purely by poor decision-making or irresponsible spending. In fact, most households follow a set of entirely rational choices. A slightly safer neighborhood may reduce commuting stress or improve access to schools. A reliable car reduces the risk of missing work. Better food and health care feel like responsible upgrades rather than indulgences. Each decision individually appears practical, even prudent. The difficulty emerges when these decisions accumulate within a system where certain expenses scale upward in almost perfect alignment with income growth. To understand why this happens, it helps to separate two types of spending that exist in nearly every household budget. The first category is discretionary consumption, which includes entertainment, travel, luxury goods, and other purchases that can be adjusted relatively easily. The second category is structural spending. These are costs that, once adopted, become difficult to reverse without significant disruption to daily life. Housing, transportation, childcare, insurance, and education typically fall into this second category. Structural expenses have a peculiar characteristic. They rarely remain static. Instead, they tend to anchor themselves to social expectations and market norms that gradually move upward over time. When someone earns a modest income, their housing options may naturally limit them to a certain range of neighborhoods or property types. When income increases, the range of available choices expands. What often follows is a subtle recalibration of what feels reasonable. A household that once spent 30% of its income on housing may continue spending roughly the same proportion after receiving raises, but the absolute dollar value grows significantly. The same dynamic occurs with transportation. A person who once purchased a used vehicle may eventually finance a newer one, not out of extravagance, but because reliability, safety features, and professional expectations make the upgrade feel appropriate. Each shift maintains the same ratio of income allocation, yet the financial commitments grow heavier in absolute terms. This process creates what economists sometimes refer to as expenditure gravity. As income increases, large fixed costs tend to expand until they occupy a similar proportion of available resources. Over time, the household budget becomes dominated by obligations that cannot easily be reduced without significant lifestyle disruption. The individual may technically be earning far more than before, but their financial flexibility does not expand at the same pace. Behavioral psychology adds another layer to this pattern. Human perception of normal adjusts remarkably quickly. Once a household becomes accustomed to a certain standard of living, stepping backward begins to feel like loss rather than neutrality. A neighborhood downgrade, a smaller apartment, or a cheaper vehicle often carries social and emotional signals that people instinctively resist. The discomfort associated with perceived regression can be powerful enough to keep households anchored to higher expense levels, even when those expenses reduce long-term financial resilience. This dynamic helps explain why many households experience persistent financial pressure even after multiple raises throughout their careers. If income doubles, but structural expenses expand proportionally, the margin between obligations and flexibility may remain surprisingly narrow. What appears from the outside to be financial progress may internally feel like running on a slightly faster treadmill. The mathematics behind this phenomenon becomes clear when we examine how fixed costs interact with income growth over time. Imagine two households beginning with identical earnings. The first household allows structural expenses to rise gradually with income increases. Housing upgrades occur every few years. Car payments become slightly larger, and additional services or subscriptions accumulate as conveniences. None of these decisions individually appear problematic, Yet together, they form a steadily expanding base of mandatory monthly costs. The second household follows a slightly different pattern. Income increases still occur, but structural costs rise more slowly. Housing upgrades may be delayed or limited, vehicles may be kept longer, and certain lifestyle improvements are treated as temporary experiments rather than permanent commitments. Over a decade, the difference between these two approaches can produce surprisingly large divergences in financial flexibility. This divergence emerges not from extreme frugality or deprivation, but from the compounding nature of fixed obligations. When structural expenses remain relatively stable while income rises, the portion of income that remains uncommitted begins to widen. That widening margin creates optionality. Optionality allows savings, investment, career transitions, and the ability to absorb unexpected financial shocks. In contrast, when structural costs expand in parallel with income, the margin of optionality remains narrow. The household may still appear prosperous, but their financial system becomes increasingly dependent on maintaining the same income level indefinitely. A temporary disruption such as job loss, health issues, or economic downturns can therefore create disproportionately large stress because the system has little room to absorb shocks. Historically, this tension has been visible across multiple generations. In the mid-20th century, a single income in many developed economies could often support housing, transportation, and family expenses while still leaving a modest buffer. Over time, however, the structural cost of housing, education, and health care increased faster than median wages. As these core expenses grew, households adapted by increasing participation in the workforce, extending working years, and relying more heavily on credit to smooth consumption. The modern middle-class experience is therefore shaped by a structural paradox. Income growth remains essential for improving quality of life, yet many of the systems surrounding housing, education, and transportation quietly scale upward in response to that same income growth. The result is that individuals may feel they are progressing economically while simultaneously experiencing persistent financial tension. Understanding this system does not require rejecting comfort or improvement. The goal is not austerity. Instead, the key insight lies in recognizing the difference between temporary upgrades and permanent structural commitments. A vacation or occasional luxury purchase may have little long-term effect on financial flexibility. Structural expenses, however, function more like anchors that remain attached to the household budget for years or decades. When viewed through this lens, the true cost of middle-class life becomes less about individual purchases and more about the architecture of the budget itself. Housing size, transportation choices, schooling arrangements, and recurring services collectively form a financial infrastructure that determines how much freedom exists within the system. Over long periods of time, small differences in this infrastructure can shape dramatically different outcomes. Two households earning the same income can experience entirely different levels of stress, opportunity, and resilience depending on how much of their income becomes locked into fixed commitments. The middle-class trap, therefore, is not defined by spending irresponsibly, but by allowing structural costs to quietly rise until financial flexibility disappears. Once this pattern becomes visible, it reveals an important shift in perspective. Financial progress is often measured by income levels or visible lifestyle improvements. Yet a more meaningful measure may be the distance between income and structural obligations. That gap, rather than income alone, determines whether a household operates within a system of pressure or within a system that gradually expands freedom over time. The difference may appear subtle at first. Years from now, two individuals might sit at similar dining tables in similar homes, earning comparable salaries. From the outside, their lives may appear nearly identical, but beneath the surface, the architecture of their financial decisions may have produced two very different systems. One where income supports expanding freedom, and another where income quietly sustains an ever-growing structure of obligations. If you take this insight seriously, the pattern begins to change. Income may still rise, comforts may still improve, but the architecture of your finances shifts. Structural costs grow slower than your earnings, and over time, almost quietly, the gap between obligation and freedom begins to widen.